Well, hi everybody, welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. I'm your host, Bill Whittle. How's everybody doing? One of these lights appears to be a little dimmer than usual. That's a little better.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. I'm your host, Bill.
Hey, listen to that. You can hear myself speaking.
How's everybody doing? One of these lights appears.
So here we are, December of 2018. It's hard to believe. It really is. Seems like the autofocus is a little weird too. We don't want to disappoint anybody by having no, autofocus is saying autofocusing, focus. And yet, hang on. This is a part of the show where we like to do all of the extremely sensitive and consuming. It's kind of sharp. Things that we would do if we had producers or staff or budget. Anyway, here we are. So we're back. I'm sorry about the absence yesterday. It's not. I know most people may not have known I wasn't in yesterday, but my dear friend Scott Ott, with his education and everything, decided to use the expression "Bill has fallen ill," which is a pretty big, extreme way for saying that something I ate had a violent argument with me. I felt I went up, got breakfast this yesterday morning. Had to be in the chair at 10:30 for the right angle shoots on Tuesday morning, and then by the time it got to be about 10 after having breakfast, I didn't feel very good. And then I texted the chaps and asked if we could have an hour's delay. And 45 minutes later, when I woke up in order to get there, I felt like I had eaten Michael Moore in one setting without condiments. I just could not believe how crummy I felt. And just for a short time, thanks to my beautiful wife, who's probably watching this now, was able to rest a little bit and get back in the game. So, yeah, don't eat the gas station sushi. Don't eat the egg salad sandwich from the Space Diner machine. All of that good advice was lost on me. But anyway, back for now. And I'm sorry about that Michael Moore line. That's what it felt like. It just felt like, my God. Anyway, so that was that, and then the rest of the week's been basically kind of slow. Sorry we had to miss you last week again, but here we are. I, for the life of me, cannot remember. Oh, I think yes. Last Wednesday I shot 9 segments. That's what it was. Anyway, so it's back. A couple things to just start a little chat before we get going. First of all, we still have Bill Whittle Now episodes to shoot, and Scott Ott is going to text me when he gets off of work, and he expects that'll be somewhere around 7:45 Pacific, so that gives us like a little over an hour and a half. Because then as soon as he gets home, I've got to shoot some of these things. It's much later for him, and he's a hard-working man, has to get up early, so it's either tonight at 7:45 Pacific or tomorrow morning at 5:45 a.m. Pacific, and I'd rather do it tonight if I can. Let's see. I've been, it's a strange and kind of wonderful thing in a way. Dave Big Booty just asked about Bush 41. I did my right angle about George Bush Sr., and I like it very much, called Flyboys, and that's should be up by tomorrow morning, if not later on today. So I don't think I'll talk about that today, because I already did. What the heck was I going to say? Oh, I remember. Although this is related to George Bush 41. I'll read something that I knew a little bit about sometimes, and it's getting harder and harder to find things I don't know a little bit about. I don't mean that to sound so arrogant, but my wife will tell you that, I will pick up something to read in the 20 seconds it takes to microwave a pizza. So I read a lot, and the thing that I'm more and more and more I'm fascinated with. I've read about everything I can find on it in the last I want to say 3 or 4 weeks, because we mentioned it on one of the shows. I want to say a month ago or somewhere in that neighborhood. And that's the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I've been just so just absolutely. I mean, I'm reading everything there is on it, and for those of you not familiar with it, it was the largest naval engagement of World War II, largest naval engagement of the modern era, and perhaps the largest naval engagement of all time. Although I want to say Salamis or one of those others, Lepanto, may have had more people involved, but Leyte Gulf was a 2-day running battle that basically had 4 different scenes, and scene 2 and scene 4. Battle of Surigao Straits, and scene 4, which is a battle off Samar, or Samar, somebody will tell me. And Dave Big Booty parenthetically mentions that George Bush got shot down on off an island named Chichijima, where they were eating people, and that's exactly right. And I tell that story a little bit in the right angle, although I think I might have got the actual number of enlisted men wrong by 1 or 2. The Japanese on Chichijima were eating people. They were basically serving up their liver to the officers. And the part that I read today after I recorded the show, and I forgot to mention, was that in some cases the officers ate them just out of sheer Bushido insanity, and some of the men ate them because they were so hungry. And I know this is absolutely horrifying, just absolutely horrifying, but to give you an idea of what George Bush evaded by swimming out to sea instead of to the shore, there's pretty good evidence that for a couple of U.S. flyers, they would eat arms and legs, but they would amputate them to keep the limbs fresh. So they'd come in, hack off an arm, chow down, wait a couple days, come get the other arm. That is beyond. I think that might be beyond anything I've ever read. But George Bush narrowly missed becoming number 8 or 9 of the 6 or 7 guys that were down there. So that aspect of his life I thought needed to be told, and we recorded it right as there was the viewing going on in the Capitol Rotunda, I think, and the ceremony. And it takes that is a world away. So it's so much. When I say a world away, I don't mean just on the other side of the planet. It's on the other side of reality. To even consider these things. He signed up as a pilot when he was 18 years old on his birthday. He was the youngest naval aviator in the Navy for a time, and prior to President Bush passing away last week, I'd been just so deep into the whole Leyte Gulf thing, and I think the thing that has got me so hooked about it was something that I'd never really considered before, and that was 2 things. Number one, the magnitude of the guys that we lost, and secondly, up until really diving into this, based on a book that Steve Green recommended called "The Fleet at Flood Tide," which was about final phase of the war from Saipan to the surrender. And then I read Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, which is an astonishingly great book about Taffy 3 and Battle off Samar, and then I read the Battle of Surigao Strait, and so on and so on and so on. But the thing that I had not considered at all, really, and I knew a fair bit about warfare and history of warfare, but I'd never really fully understood just how horrible naval combat is, because it always looks so. What's the word I'm looking for? the scale is too big. I mean, you're looking across 3 miles of ocean and you see a kamikaze plane hit an aircraft carrier, and an aircraft carrier is an enormous structure, and the fact that there's a couple thousand people on board there is a mathematical thing, but you don't get to really understand it. But once you take it down to the level of a destroyer or a destroyer escort, where everybody knows everybody's name, and it's it's just absolutely astonishing. There are so many details about this, and obviously, I could do 10 hours on this. But the Battle of Surigao Strait, the night prior to the Battle of off Samar with Taffy 3, two independent Japanese fleets sailed up Surigao Strait in darkness, were met by American PT boats, American destroyers, American cruisers, and even American battleships. And they lost, I want to say they took 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, a couple light cruisers, and maybe 5 or 6 destroyers in, and 1 destroyer came back. It was incredibly brave action on the part of the commander, who, I want to say Nishimura, who basically was offered up as bait, as a distraction, pull forces down to the south away from the Gulf, so that Admiral Kurita and his... the idea behind the Japanese plan to defend the Philippines was here's the island of Leyte, and we're going to make a landing on Leyte. And then up at the top, Admiral Ozawa takes 1 Japanese fleet carrier and 2 or 3 light carriers, and comes, because this whole thing is being covered by 7th Fleet is doing the landing, and 3rd Fleet is Admiral Halsey's strike force, which is an insanely powerful group of aircraft carriers, 9 or 10 aircraft carriers, battleships, everything. And he's covering the Leyte landings, but 7th Fleet is actually doing the shore bombardment with their escort carriers and so on. So far so good. So the Japanese decide what they're going to do is they're going to send Admiral Ozawa down with the Japanese aircraft carriers, because they know that Halsey is so aggressive and so temperamental that when he sees aircraft carriers, there's no way on earth he's going to leave them there. So sure enough, this northern diversion works. Halsey peels his entire 3rd Fleet off, goes chasing after Ozawa, leaves Leyte Gulf, and just prior to this, or simultaneous to this, the Japanese send another force down across the bottom, which comes right up Surigao Straits and is just a sacrificial lamb. It just walks into the slaughter. But that pulls forces south, and Halsey's going north, and American battleships are going south, and Leyte Gulf is wide open. And then on the morning of the next day, along comes the actual serious punch, which is Admiral Kurita's center force. And everybody who wasn't Bill Halsey thought that Bill Halsey was blocking the north end of this landing, but he had gone off on an errand. And so there was nothing left to defend against the most powerful surface force the Japanese ever put together, certainly arguably the most powerful one in history. Super battleships Yamato and Musashi, both part of this mission. And what had especially galled me in reading the history was that Halsey didn't know, and in fact we didn't know, that by the time that Ozawa was dangling those aircraft carriers, the Japanese aircraft carriers, as bait, they were essentially useless. We had done so much damage to their air groups, their airplanes, all of their trained pilots. The 3 carriers had something like 40 airplanes between them, and they were simply... Japan was out of naval aviation by this point. There was nothing to lose by losing those carriers, because they didn't have any airplanes that they could fly off of them. Anyway. So you end up with this whole thing where you have these very fragile, very, very inexpensive and easy to build escort carriers, jeep carriers. I talked about this a little bit last time. That are not designed to enter combat under any circumstances. They don't have the watertight compartments. Their skin is much thinner and brittle, steel, and all the rest of it. And then you've got, in the northernmost of these groups, the ones closest to the incoming Japanese clenched steel fist, you've got 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. 3 destroyers, Hull, Hewick, and the Johnston. And then 4 destroyer escorts, which are even smaller than them, the 5 destroyers. The 3 destroyers had 5-inch gun turrets. The destroyer escorts had 2. And 3 torpedoes on the escorts, as opposed to, I want to say, 10 on the Fletcher-class destroyers. So anyway, you've got these tiny little surface ships, 6 of them. 3 of them are tiny little destroyers, and 4 of them are half that powerful, and they are destroyer escorts. And they basically pick up radar in the north and hear some anti-aircraft fire, see some anti-aircraft fire. And right around 6:30 in the morning, 7:30 in the morning on the 25th of October, 1944, they look to the north and they can see these tall masts, the pagoda masts. The Japanese built their surface ships with very, very, very tall structures because they optically sighted their gunnery, and the higher you are above the horizon, the further you can see. And Yamato, for example, had guns that could fire at 25, 26 miles, which is over the horizon. So these guys in these tiny little escort carriers and these tiny, tiny, tiny little destroyers and destroyer escorts are looking to the north, and through binoculars they can see the tops of these towers. They can't even see the hulls yet, but they start to see these, these tower structures just kind of coming up over the horizon. And next thing you know, they're being run down by an astonishingly powerful fleet. There's no sign of Halsey. There's no sign of the defense. The battleships are too far to the south. They've got these hollow-skinned jeep carriers, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. And this is where the battle becomes, just for me, just becomes sublime. I mean, I've always been an enormous student of these great moments in history, and the Battle of Britain and Rorke's Drift and the stand on a little round top and all of it. But I don't think I can find a story as quite as amazing as this one in the Battle off Samar. So the 6 escort carriers, they're aircraft carriers, they're small ones, about a third the complement of a major fleet carrier. They start running. They want to run south to get away from the Japanese, but they also have to go east into the wind because they got to launch their airplanes. The admiral in charge of Taffy 3, Sprague, says, I want you to make smoke to cover us up. It might buy us another 10 or 15 minutes. None of these guys expected to be alive a half an hour later. They all thought they'd be either dead or swimming in half an hour, because this Japanese force coming down from the north is not only unbelievably powerful, but it's also very, very fast. It's a 30-knot fleet, and the escort carriers could do 16 knots. So they start running, and the admiral orders the destroyers to start making smoke. So they make smoke, which actually does quite a bit to help the carriers. But the problem with making smoke is, if you're one of the guys making smoke, and the wind is moving the way it was moving, then what you're doing is the smoke that is protecting the aircraft carriers behind you is also making you stand out directly, because you're now in front of this line of smoke. So this is where it becomes it really becomes almost unbelievable. Heermann was the other destroyer, Hoke and Heermann. So there were basically 4 ships in this conflict, and 2 of them get a lot of attention, and the 2 that don't get as much attention are the USS Hoke and USS Heermann. And understandably so, from a storytelling point of view, it would really, really suck to be one of the crew members of these and see all the glory going to the other 2 places. It's certainly, they were all crews on all the Taffy 3 crews were incredibly brave. But basically what happens is, without orders, USS Johnson, captained by Everett Evans, decides that he and his little destroyer, with its 5-inch diameter guns, he just turns around. The whole group is fleeing south, and USS Johnson just turns around and sails straight into the Japanese invasion force and starts opening fire. And for 2 hours, USS Johnston, I said Johnson, it's Johnston. USS Johnston is fighting the most powerful battleships ever created. To give you an idea of the forces that he was up against, the Yamato, the super Japanese battleship, which was one of, I want to say, 3 battleships that were 3 or 4 in that surface group, the Yamato weighed more. The total displacement weight of the Yamato was greater than all of Taffy 3, including the aircraft carriers. So this one battleship weighed more than the 6 aircraft carriers and the escort vehicles. Just one of the turrets on Yamato weighed more than the Johnston did. And this guy just sailed into hell. I mean, he just sailed into hell. And this was the part I mentioned at the very beginning. Your uncle, what is it? Teddyman or Teddlyman? Sorry. Your uncle was on USS Heermann, very proud to make it through this battle. I'm going to imagine that your uncle's not with us anymore. I hope he survived the battle. And I just want to tell you on behalf of me, if he has any surviving relatives other than yourself, you tell him I'm unbelievably proud to belong to the same country as him. Heermann, Hoke, Johnston, and Roberts. So off goes Evans, sailing into the teeth of this thing, opening fire, dodging these incoming shells, and surrealistically enough, all of the Japanese battleships had die markers on their shells, because if you got 15 guys shooting at one target, or even 4 big guys, let's say, each one of the ships is trying to correct its gunnery by checking where the last salvo lands. If the last salvo runs short, you want to elevate the guns and push the next salvo further out. And so each one of these ships had different colored dye. And so every time one of these big battleship shells put up a column of water 15 stories high, and it'd be either green or blue or red, just these rainbow splashes of water all around Johnston. Interestingly enough, the skipper was doing something that it's almost like one of these stories where you just can't believe nobody figured it out. But basically, what he was doing was he was chasing the splashes. So if he was, the Musashi was the other super battleship along with Yamato. Musashi was sunk the day before in battle number 1 of the 4 battles of Leyte Gulf. And so what he would do, he had a destroyer which is small and fast. Those were its only defenses, because the armor would stop nothing. And he would chase the splashes, so whenever he'd see rounds hitting the water, he would steer directly for that spot, because they always, this is the part that's so interesting and so strange. Everybody's mentioning World of Warships. I've seen it, I haven't played it. I've seen numbers, and I've watched hours of gameplay of World of Warships, and I think it's great, but that was way before I heard this story. I'm sure I'll get around to that eventually. So what he would do is, whenever these big, enormous splashes would come up in the water, he would steer directly to that spot, because he knew that since they missed, they were going to adjust their aim. And so by going to where the lightning had just struck, he had a very good chance of not getting struck again. Which is, in other words, if the gunners on board the ships had not changed anything, if they'd realized what he was doing hadn't changed anything except compensated for their own motion, shot one round and then waited till he moved to that shot another round, it would have been all over. So Johnson is making this run in and miraculously doesn't get hit for a while, launches its torpedoes, scores a hit on one of the cruisers, as I recall, comes around and starts getting smashed. He's retiring out of the battle. He's taken all of these hits. And then Sprague orders the rest of the escort to go and make a torpedo run. First the destroyers, then the destroyer escorts against the incoming Japanese column, trying to slow him down a little bit. So as Johnson is coming back out of the battle, Captain Evans has already had left part of his left hand shot off. It's just missing. It's gone. And he's retiring out of the battle with a lot of holes in his ship. And when the order comes to go make the torpedo attack, the USS Johnston had already made the torpedo attack and scored some hits. And in order to get the torpedoes in, you have to get in under 10,000 yards and probably better to 7,000 yards. Yamato can reach to 25,000 yards or more. So you just had to go in and just take all the shell fire and pray to God they didn't hit you, because one big shell would probably do it. And all the secondary batteries and the destroyers and everything. He's just going in there, sliding his way through there, gets his torpedoes off, comes out, he's taking hits everywhere, engine's gone, he's got half his speed, which is survival for the destroyer. He's had half his hand blown off, the bridge has been hit. He's retiring out of battle, and the order comes for the other 5 escorts to make a torpedo attack. And as these other destroyers, the Heermann and the Holt, and the destroyer escorts, as they start doing the same thing that Johnson had just done, which is these little tiny tin cans with no armor at all, racing into the teeth of this unbelievably powerful surface force. As Johnson is coming out of the fight, he sees the other destroyers going in, and he doesn't have any torpedoes. And he's lost an engine, and he's taken heavy, heavy casualties. And Evans says to the rest of the crew, he says, we're going to go in with them. We can draw some fire. Maybe they'll fire at us instead of firing at the guys with the torpedoes. At the very least, we can put some of these rounds on these things. Now, you got to understand that the guns on the Johnston and on the destroyer escorts like the Roberts, those guns could never penetrate the hull of a battleship. There was zero chance that those rounds could go through the armor. They were far too small. They just literally bounce off the hull. But they could put rounds up into the superstructure and the bridge and cause some fires and suppress the gunners and all the rest of it. And the torpedoes could actually sink a big ship if you put enough into them. I want to say Musashi took something like 18 torpedoes and 20 bomb hits, something on that nature. Both Musashi and Yamato it's incredible what it took to sink those guys. So here comes Johnston out of the fight. The other guys are going into the fight. Johnston basically says, we've just had our butt mauled. We don't have any ship-killing weapons anymore. We're going to now turn around. We're going to go in the rest of these guys. We're going to go in again to help them with the odds. And somewhere in this order, which I'm a little more familiar with, but I'm not going to bore you with the details of, a destroyer escort, which is, instead of 5 5-inch guns, has 2 5-inch guns, is essentially the size of a decent commercial fishing boat, really. The captain on there was some confusion about this. I thought it was Evans, but it turns out it was Robert Copeland, I think, Bob Copeland, on the captain of the Samuel B. Roberts, which was the smallest fighting ship in the Navy. The smallest fighting ship in the Navy is going up against the largest battleship ever built, plus 2 other battleships, plus 4 or 5 cruisers, plus 10 destroyers. Every single one of them bigger than she was. And the captain on the Copeland issues a statement to his crew, and he says, we are about to go into battle against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. That'll get your attention. So this tiny little thing is not even a tin can, it's half a tin can. This destroyer escort goes sailing right into the middle of this Japanese column. And the guns are blasting. They're just getting off something like 400 rounds in half an hour. It's unbelievable. And they just went in there, and they got off their torpedoes, and they just kept hitting the Japanese ships. They kept hitting them. The rounds were essentially bouncing off, but they were putting out so much fire. The Johnston, especially, and the Roberts, were putting out such an incredible volume of fire. Even though they were shooting cap guns at these tanks, they were shooting so much and so accurately that the Japanese really began to wonder what the hell's going on. The Japanese thought they were cruisers. They didn't know they were destroyers or destroyer escorts. Thought they were cruisers. They thought the escort carriers were fleet carriers. They thought we were much more powerful than we were. And because these guys went at them as hard as they did, they started to have some second thoughts. The Japanese send some destroyers out to put some torpedoes into the escort carriers, but the Roberts just runs right at them and forces them to shoot early, so the torpedoes miss. And sure enough, the Roberts get shot to hell and sunk. So the Hoke sunk whole, the Roberts sunk, the Johnston sunk. One of the escort carriers was sunk by Japanese gunfire, Gambier Bay. The St. Lo, a second one of the escort carriers, was destroyed at the last minute by the first genuine kamikaze attack, intentional kamikaze attack. But just when the Japanese had it won, because they simply, the shells were just literally bouncing off of them. Once the Japanese had it won, the tenacity of the destroyer fight and the tenacity of the aviators, and this is the other part of the story I just wanted to tell, just to give you an idea of what George Bush wasn't in this battle particularly, but this is what life was like for these young men. When the Japanese were sighted, you had 6 escort carriers, which instead of having maybe 90 planes on them, had maybe 30. And all of these planes were largely out of ammunition because they'd been bombarding the shore during the landing for the last 3 days. And since the Japanese ships are on the horizon closing fast, they just launched whatever planes they had with whatever ammunition they had. Now, we had a very effective dive bomber, the Dauntless, and we had an extraordinarily good naval bomber called the Avenger. And that's what George Bush flew, was an Avenger. The Avenger was a torpedo airplane, but could also carry bombs and depth charges. And as these guys are waking up to the fact that their lives are probably going to be over in 15 or 20 minutes, they just launch everything they can, mostly because they're so sure that the carriers are going to be sunk by gunfire that they wanted to at least get the planes off. And so the second part of this story is these airmen launching strike after strike after strike, individually, not coordinated in any way, going against the most ferocious anti-aircraft fire that maybe has ever existed. The Yamato alone could put up a just incredible curtain of anti-aircraft fire. And the thing about this that was so amazing was many of the Avengers just plain had no weapons on them. They either had 250-pound or 100-pound bombs, which is like throwing a wad of gum at the Yamato. So what these American pilots would do is they would come in, and to launch a torpedo attack, you have to do everything you don't want to do, which means you have to fly low, straight as an arrow, and slow. So these Avenger pilots would start to make runs on the Japanese column, and these guys are basically just sitting ducks. They're just coming in a straight line like they would on a torpedo run, and as they get closer, they open their bomb bay doors, torpedo doors, and all of the anti-aircraft fire is directed to these guys, and the Japanese ships are turning away and maneuvering, and the guy gets close enough to launch his torpedoes, and it turns out he doesn't drop any torpedoes because he doesn't have any torpedoes. He just simply, they just went in there and again and again and again without weapons, went in there through the teeth of that anti-aircraft fire and bluffed them, made them turn away because the Japanese couldn't be sure that they didn't have any weapons. There are stories of guys strafing these battleships and cruisers. One guy made something like 15 or 20 passes before he ran out of ammunition. Then he flew back to an island, landed. One of these pilots landed at an Army base that was just being set up, Army Air Force Base, and he said, "We are under attack out there. We need all the bombs and we've got, and all the fuel that you've got." And this Army major said, "I can't do that. I've got a flight of P-38 Lightnings coming in 3 days, and this bomb loads and the fuels for those airplanes. I can't give it to you." And this Navy pilot drew his revolver and pointed it at the Army officer and said, "You're going to put those bombs on this airplane right now, or else something bad's going to happen." And so they rearmed and just went out there and just kept hitting him and hitting him and hitting him and hitting him. And finally, Kurita, who was in charge of this unbelievably powerful force, simply lost his nerve. But he didn't lose his nerve because he just chickened out. He lost his nerve because the attack against his forces was so intense and so severe that he didn't think he'd survive to get to the landing sites in Leyte. When, after the battle was over, certainly the Americans knew from the moment they saw the first blip on the radar that this fleet that Kurita had, this Japanese fleet, could not be stopped by anything. It would just, if it sailed directly south, there's nothing that could have stopped it. Put a couple torpedoes into the Yamato, it doesn't even slow down, doesn't even feel it. They could have gone right into the middle of Leyte Gulf. They could have sank all of the transports, could have destroyed the 6 carriers in Taffy 3, another 6 carriers in the center group, another 6 carriers in the southern group, all part of that same unit. Plus their escorts could have gone right through them like a bull in a china shop. But the intensity of the attack on the Japanese fleet was so severe that he basically, just when he had the battle won, he just said, we're turning around. We're not going to get through this. It's just the fire's too intense. To give you some idea of this, I mean, that's the mega story, and you think, oh, what heroes? Certainly they were, but in order to appreciate what this consisted of, this kind of courage consisted of, you have to have some idea of what this kind of fighting was like. One of the destroyers, one of the reasons that the Americans survived as long as they did was that the Japanese were using armor-piercing shells designed to go through the thick armor of battleships and cruisers. But the armor on the American destroyers and the escort carriers, the armor was so thin that was actually their saving grace. Scores, if not hundreds, of rounds shot right through the ship. The shell would come in, punch a hole like this, punch a hole on the other side, and go out without exploding. And if they had been using high explosive ammunition instead of armor piercing, which would have been the right ammunition if they were going against cruisers and battleships, then it would have been over way early. So time and time again, Johnston and Hoke and Heerman and Roberts are just getting shot right through, like a bullet round going through a tin can, just right through the other side. But to give you some idea of what this kind of battle does, I'm trying to think of a couple of examples that really stuck out in my mind, and a couple of them are this. One of these shells exploded in a sick bay on one of these vessels. And when the teams went down there afterwards to see if there were any survivors, all they found were mattresses that were up against the bulkheads, and the mattresses had little shreds of cloth on it where the sailors had been blown through the mattress. The force of the explosion had blown their bodies through the mattress, and little shreds of their uniform were sticking to the springs. Just body parts everywhere, blood everywhere. Guys coming out from the engine room on one of these vessels where the steam that runs the ship's turbines as well as powers a lot of the other systems, that steam gets hit. It's under enormous pressure. It's 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And they said there were stories of guys coming out of the engine room of either the Johnson or the Roberts, and these guys would climb out of this engine room, and they said they were absolutely white. They were just snowy white. And the reason they were snowy white was because they'd just been boiled like shrimp. Their skin had been boiled off, and they were just completely white, and they just sat down on the deck and fortunately were dead within 2 or 3 minutes. There was a guy, I should know I'm pretty sure he was on the Johnston, named, I forget his first name, but he's named Carr. I believe he won the Medal of Honor, was awarded the Medal of Honor. The captain of the Copeland was, and so was Evans, as I believe the captain of the Johnston. But there was one of these guns, I think it was on the Johnston, one of these 5-inch turrets, and they're all pretty much self-contained. Once the targeting systems are knocked out, each one of the turrets fire independently. And I want to say it was gun number 4 on Johnston, but I may be wrong about that. But in any event, this particular turret, and again, I might be wrong about the numbers, but they're close. This particular turret had 225 rounds of ammunition, and they fired 224 of them. When the turret exploded, the gun exploded because the device that would blow the hot gases out of the barrel was disabled. So they're putting rounds into a barrel. The barrel's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And when they're just got one round's in the chamber and they got the last round ready to go, the gun explodes and explodes inside this tiny turret, basically just vaporizes most of the guys. And when they sent a team down there to find out this gun crew that fired 224 of its total 225 shells, they got in there and they found this guy, Seaman Carr, and he was standing up against the side of the turret, and the force of the explosion had ripped a hole in him from his neck all the way down to his groin. He was just opened up. And above his head, he's still alive. Above his head, he's holding a 55-pound 5-inch shell. He's holding it up like this. His entrails are falling out of his body because he's sliced open. And he is holding a shell over his head, the last round, the last one, and he's begging the people that came in to try and rescue him to help him load the gun, to put that final round into the gun. The gun was gone. The gun was useless. They finally had to take the shell away from him and tell him they were going to fire it, and 5 minutes later he was dead. But these kind of stories, and the guys going again and again and again with no weapons, and just getting shot at like that, and then realizing you're getting shot at. I can't even shoot back. I'm not going in on this run so that I can bomb this thing or torpedo it. After a while, I'm not even going in so I can strafe it. I'm simply going in on the hope that it's going to think I have some ammunition and turn away. And that's exactly what happened. The Japanese ships had to keep turning to avoid bomb strikes or torpedo strikes that really didn't come. And the torpedo spreads that the Johnston and the Copeland put out made them turn. And every time they turned away, gave the carriers a little bit more time to get out of there. You hear stories like this, and you think that that these people, not even of the same species, I suppose I should say we're not of the same species, that there's just something so unbelievably monumental about it. And the stories about guys like Mr. Carr and all of these others, stories of there was one guy, I think he was on the Gambier Bay on the escort carrier. When the thing got hit, all of this flaming gasoline goes down into the hangar deck, and this guy had to crawl underneath the fuselage of airplanes. He's already badly burned and wounded. To crawl underneath, already been hit in the abdomen too, something had fallen on him. Had to crawl underneath these burning airplanes and basically seal off the gasoline supply. And what's remarkable about that, other than its own remarkability, is what he'd done the exact same thing just a few hours earlier. He went back in and did it again, I don't, the temptation is to say that we're just not made out of the same stuff as them. But that's just not true. We have people like this right now. I've met them. I've met many of them who are made of the same stuff. And my respect and admiration for them is boundless. And I can't get enough of the details of this because I feel like I owe them that. And I feel like I owe them, at the very least, a chance to tell a few thousand of you people about this story. In the 70s, they made a movie called Tora, Tora, Tora about the attack on Pearl Harbor, which I saw when I was, it was 73, 74, 75, somewhere around there. So I was probably 15, 16 years old. And that was one where the bad guys win. And then a couple years later, they made a movie called Midway. And Midway was amazing. I've talked about Midway several times. I knew a fair amount about Midway, knew next to nothing about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and very, very little about the Battle off Samar Island. And it just makes me wonder why these stories haven't been told. Natasha and I have seen a couple of movies this year. We saw Nutcracker because I thought it was going to be about the Nutcracker, and it had nothing to do with the Nutcracker. It was a $100 million horrendous ripoff. And every time we come out of a movie like that, my beautiful wife says, "What could have been done with that money?" And I think, yeah. So, you know, when you can say this is a true story, that matters. It really matters. And these names should be on everybody's lips. You know, I mean, we really everybody should know about Ernest Evans. I might have said Everett Evans. Ernest Evans, captain of the Johnston. Everybody should know about Evans. They should know about his crew. They should know about what they did. When the Johnston sank, prior to its sinking, the bridge had been hit and the steering had been knocked out. And so the captain of the ship went back to the very back to the fantail and opened a hatch. And down below, since the hydraulic steering was out, he had to steer his ship. Now, you remember, he's under constant fire by these Japanese heavy ships, and if he goes on a straight line, he's dead. So the only way they could turn the ship was to manually turn the rudder, which involved two strong men turning this enormous wheel, which was normally driven by hydraulics. And they said the strongest men in the fleet could do this for maybe 10 minutes. And he's screaming left rudder, right rudder, left rudder, screaming down. These men are just hauling on this thing, getting this thing to turn. Bought him 2 hours for Johnston, 2 hours for the USS Johnston. And saved the entire carrier fleet, saved all of their escorts, probably saved the Leyte transports, and may have saved the landing. If those transports had been destroyed, and if the Japanese Navy had shelled our units ashore, which were right on the beach, then the Philippines invasion would have been a catastrophe, and the war would have gone on for 2 more years. But when you think about all the money that's spent on making these really, really pretty terrible movies, in the days, one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by all this stuff, by the computer graphics stuff, is because we are now 2 years away, probably at the most, from me being able to tell this story in here. Right? There. That space. That's how much room I need to be able to tell the story of Taffy 3 in a year or two. I need a budget, but I don't need a $50 million budget. I need a $300,000 budget. Because computer graphics now are so good that they're certainly better than the models. Anybody who's seen the kind of computer graphics I'm talking about, is it a not 47 yet, says Letters from Iwo Jima and Flags of Our Father. Quite good. They're excellent movies. They're directed by Clint Eastwood, who has been my unbelievable privilege to have gotten to know, and who's complimented me on the work I do, which I'll never, ever, ever, ever get used to. But my point is this. Here's what I would like to do. I've got this series of movies telling the story of America in space and so on. And it makes me want to jump ahead in that story arc 10 years into the future and retell this entire story using science fiction assets. Because to tell the heart of the story, what you need to do is you need to see how big these ships are on the enemy fleet and how small the destroyer and destroyer escorts are. And to do it in computer graphics, if you've seen Flags of Our Father or Letters from Iwo Jima, which I think is actually a better movie, the computer graphics, and the computer graphics in the Pacific as well, for that matter, but for those two movies, those two Clint Eastwood movies, the computer graphics of the fleet, of the attack, of the landing boats going ashore, is as good as it's going to look. I mean, it's much, much, much better than models or some of these, recreations that they use with the wrong equipment and stuff. It's absolutely fantastic. And that requires a person with an eye and who knows how to tell a story. It requires some computing stations. You render the thing online in these render farms, and for for a couple $100,000 with the quality of the computer graphics, it would not look like a computer graphics movie. I think you could probably do it in a year with motion capture on the face and the body, which can be done in this room. And I think within a year you would be able to do it with people that were so close to being realistic that essentially you would not be able to tell. Certainly among the young people who need to see these things and hear these stories, who've grown up with game graphics that have just been getting better and better and better every year and started out just simply unbelievably terrible, but get better and better and better. Certainly of the quality that they would be able to accept without batting an eyelid. And I'd love to tell that story. First of all, I'd love to tell it in the Star Citizen universe, which will cost a few tens of thousands of dollars, I would say. But once the factory gets set up here, and we have the beginning of a staff and a team here, then you could do it realistically. Some of the water effects, even Titanic. I mean, Titanic is 10 years old now. And 10 years in computer graphics it's a century. But even then, the water and the ship were just very, very good. And they're much better now. So it's strangely enough, because Dave Big Booty says he'd rather see Big Bat Problems first. I'd like to see Big Bat Problems first, too. It's a live-action movie I've had and talked about before. But strangely enough, one of the things that has hit me so strongly over the last year or so is that I can make a photorealistic version of the battle off Samar, the biggest naval engagement in history, for less money than I could make a low-budget science fiction horror film about a bunch of people driving down the freeway and killing aliens. Because of the box, because of the computer, and the cost of the graphics. And did I say? Thank you very much, Babyface Nelson. I said Titanic is 10 years old. It's 20 years old. 20. Sorry about that, Dave Big Booty, other guys, and Witty Fool. 20 years old. And it looked okay then. So what I'd like to do is I could tell that story in the Star Citizen universe for very little money, and then for a little more money, I could do a feature-length film. You know, how many speaking roles are there in this? 10, maybe? It would just be so good, and I mean to do it. I really do. It doesn't seem to me to be a coincidence that that this power of storytelling is starting to fall into my hands just at the point in my life where I actually know what I could do with it. Not only would I love to do the story of Taffy 3, I will do the story of Taffy 3. One way or another, I expect I'll do it as science fiction first, and then if not, I will tell this story, and I'll tell it right. And the destroyer escort, this Samuel B. Roberts, the Sammy B. Got nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship because it went into the teeth of a Japanese surface fleet composed of battleships, and this tiny little destroyer escort went in there and fought like a battleship for an hour and a half. When this Roberts was heading in on its final pass, it passed the Johnston, which I think at this point was dead in the water, burning, completely smashed, not recognizable. It's just a burning hunk of metal in the water. And the crew on the Samuel Johnson is heading in on another attack run, and the crew on the Roberts is heading in for another attack run, And USS Johnston is dead in the water, just getting hit by everything. Every Japanese ship kept firing at it just out of sheer frustration, just taking hits all the time, people getting blown to pieces. One guy's friend who's the doctor, he sees him helping with the wounded. He says there's more wounded inside. His friend is heading to the back of the ship. He sees the doctor go inside a hatch, and the second he gets inside the hatch, a round impacts right there and just vaporizes everything in there. So again and again and again, you've got these things. But as the Roberts was going into the fight, the Johnson was dead in the water, and they passed him. And the two captains, who I think are two of the most remarkable men that we've ever had produced in this country, Copeland and Evans. When the Roberts was heading in to make another attack on the Japanese, he looked over and he saw the wreckage of the Johnston. And he could see Captain Evans, his counterpart, on the fantail, his left hand all bandaged up and covered in blood. And as they went in, Evans just looked up at him, and he didn't salute him or anything. He just looked at him and waved at him, and that's the last they saw of him. Johnston sank, and Evans was seen in the water. He got off the ship, but he was never seen again. And the most horrible part of this whole story is that these unbelievably brave men on these battleships, on these American destroyers, were in the water for 2 days, and another 100 at least of them died of either delirium or of their wounds. Some of these guys are horribly burned or horribly wounded. They're in the water. They're expecting to get rescued. Not a mystery where they were. Everybody knew what was going on, but they just missed them on the coordinates. They were looking in the wrong place. These guys are on rafts for 2 days. After 2 days, they said that is much like the Indianapolis, which happened a few months later. You got these guys in the water, 60 guys around not even a raft, just some floating cargo nets and wreckage and stuff. And they say that, what would happen is during the night, it'd be very quiet, and then off on one corner of this circle, you'd hear this yell and then this very, very high-pitched screaming and thrashing around, and then it got quiet again. And these sharks were just taking people, just taking them. And 2 days and 2 nights of that they had to put up with. As just before they got rescued, their thirst and their delirium was so great that a large number of sailors, something 10 or 20 of them or something, asked for permission to dive down, take off their life jackets, dive down, because they knew that the Johnson was just a few feet underneath them, and all they had to do was just dive down, get to the ship, and they knew where there was a supply of fresh water. So they asked permission to quickly go down there and get to the fresh water, and they'd be right back with it. And a number of sailors were convinced that there was a little mini lake of fresh water, like just a few feet underneath the salt water, and any number of these guys in the days or the nights slipped off their life jackets and just dove underwater to get to the fresh water that was just down there, just below the surface, never seen again. And, my feeling is if I didn't have to go through that, and I didn't because they did, then my purpose here is to make sure that they're not forgotten, that they don't disappear and are only known to people who are willing to do the digging necessary to find out stories that should be front page news. These guys' birthdays should be national holidays. There shouldn't be a high school kid in America that couldn't tell you the story I just told you with the same degree of detail. And it's a wonderful job, and somebody's got to do it. So, yeah. Somebody's asking me some Star Citizen questions, and just to give you, since it's a very specific question and a very specific answer, I'll spend 20 seconds on this. if I would do it in Star Citizen, I would have the Vandal kingships be the Japanese battleships that have all these other Vandal cruisers and destroyers and so on. Vandals are the race of aliens in the Star Citizen universe. And I would have to play around a little bit with our size ships, but I would use the Kraken as a escort carrier, light carrier, not designed for combat. I would use the Javelin for the destroyers, and I'd use the Idris for the destroyer escorts. I actually thought about going even smaller than that and using like the Hammerhead and the Retaliator, but that's inside football. So anyway, enough of that. So we've got time to do some questions until I get the text from Mr. Scott Ott in about 40 minutes from now. Thank you for putting up with me for that. Had to get that out of my system. And if you really want to do yourself a favor, download or go to a bookstore or go to Amazon and order The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. It's the story of Taffy 3. It'll blow your mind. It's just blow your mind. Okay, let's see what we got. Going to our Facebook page. I was real happy with that show I did on Chinese genetic experimentation. It's so much fun doing this Bill Whittle Now show because I get questions. I have no idea what's coming, and so many of these questions I have no answer for. I have to puzzle it out in real time in front of you guys, which is the fun of it. And I remember time and time again thinking, the nice thing about having a value set is that it kind of teaches you how to live, I mean, having a code to live by is useful in that it provides you a code to live by. And it really does work. I mean, if you understand these fundamental principles, and they're not difficult to understand, you can be asked almost any question and be able to find an answer that is both fair and just and doesn't suck. All right, Stratosphere launch questions, as many as we can before Scotty comes in here. So I'm just going to deal with them in the order that they are. That's the common and never-ending caveat. I don't put these things in order, and I don't have time to figure out what the order is. I just read them as they come. It looks like 5s and 4s. So we'll start with Bob Neef, K-N-I-E-F-F. I hope it's Bob Neef. When, in your estimation, will humans land on Mars? Also, just for fun, when will a human land on Pluto? If you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, Bob, I would have said, I don't think they're going to land on Mars. I really didn't. And had been so disappointed by NASA and so simply blown away by all of the destruction of NASA as a team that accomplishes a mission and its conversion into a standing army of bureaucrats. And then along comes Elon Musk, who had made some big promises. I'll tell you when I began to think we might actually go to Mars. I began to think we might go to Mars when Falcon Heavy put the Tesla Roadster in orbit, and I saw the two boosters come back and make simultaneous landings at the Kennedy Space Center. That's when I began to realize, we might actually do it. And my confidence in this was and is bolstered by the fact that everything useful that's ever been done, not useful, everything amazing that's ever been done, and I can't think of an exception to this. Here's Mr. Scotty Ott. Hang on a second, please, while I put on my reading spectacles and find out what's going on here. Just a second here. I know you're in the mood. No, I'd like to get it done now. Sorry. Let's see what he says. But when I saw those boosters coming back, I thought everything exceptional that's ever happened has largely been the result of either one person's vision It's never one person. There's always a team that has to execute, and that team has to believe in the product. But it's always a vision that's driven by one individual. I can't think of many exceptions to this case. I was talking with my beautiful... Perfect. He should be home in 40 minutes. I love it. Excuse me again. Sorry. I was talking with Natasha about this. We were talking about the iPhone, and just give you an idea why I think that we might go to Mars, because Elon Musk is Elon Musk, and he's very eccentric and very unusual and so on. But this, I mean, this device has changed the world. I mean, the smartphone has changed the world. We didn't know we needed it until we got it. And then once we had it, we can't imagine how we lived without it. Uber is just one example of one of hundreds of examples of a technology that is so unbelievably useful and cool. And none of it would have been possible without the smartphone. And the smartphone wouldn't have been possible without Steve Jobs. I know he's a very unpleasant individual in a lot of ways. None of that matters really to me. I'm sure it matters to his kids and his family, but to me, it's the price of genius. And the story, in a nutshell, the reason we have Uber, and I've got flight navigation programs that I can put on my iPhone that'll guide me anywhere in the world to within 3 feet, and that's probably all I need. If I can find myself within 3 feet of an airport, chances are pretty good I'm going to be able to make the landing. George, that's my favorite name, I think. George said Tim Cook is worse. Tim Cook is the anti-Jobs. Tim Cook is the current president of Apple. He's an administrator, he's a manager, and he is kind of a bureaucrat. And that's why Apple hasn't done anything interesting since Steve Jobs died. But let's just take this device just for 1 second. I'm mashing the story, but it's not too far off the mark to say that Steve Jobs went to the Apple engineers. They just finished the iPod and so on, which itself seemed pretty amazing at the time. And he said, okay, what I want to do next is I want to do a phone. Okay, well, we've got cell phones, flip phones that are about that size. Yes, but I want it also to have a camera. Okay, that's an interesting challenge, Steve. I think we can find a way to work that out. And I also want it to be an iPod, so I want the iPod in it. Okay. So you can play all your music, yeah. And it has to have GPS. What now? Yeah, the phone has to know where it is. Really? Yeah, and not only does the phone have to know where it is, the phone has to know its own orientation. It needs to have accelerometers in there and solid-state gyroscopes so that the phone knows what its angle is and so that you can steer things with the phone and so on. And a number of engineers just said, Steve, that's impossible, can't be done. And he basically said, if you think it's impossible, you're fired. Your job is not to tell me whether it's possible or not. Your job is to tell me how to do it. Your job is to figure out a way to do it. This is what it has to have in it, and now you're going to find a way to make it happen. And without that, this wouldn't be here. There's no way, there's zero chance that a committee could have possibly designed and built one of these. Just not possible. Government couldn't have done it, and IBM couldn't have done it because they'd have to get all this stuff past the board and all the rest of it. And he just said, no, well, I don't care. I know it's difficult, but it's not impossible. Do it. And so they did it. And then just because of the kind of person he was, he got his one of the prototypes, before early prototype. And instead of putting it up on top of a velvet cushion and admiring it, he just stuck it in his pocket for a week. And after a week, he comes and shows his engineers, and the screen is just completely scratched and virtually unreadable. And he said, we can't have this. And they said, well, Steve, you put it in your pocket. And you got keys in there and coins in there. And Steve Jobs says, I know that. Other people have keys and coins too. They're going to put it in their pocket. They're not going to put this thing in a special case. You need to make glass that's hard enough to resist the scratches. Well, this is the hardest glass that we have, Steve. There's no harder glass than this. Well, then do some chemistry and find me a glass that will not be scratched by keys. I've had this iPhone in my pocket. I've had a number of them I've had them since 2010, maybe 11, something like that. I know some people have, but I personally have never put a scratch on an iPhone, ever. And I remember any number of the old cell phones being just useless after a while. Build it, do it. So to answer your question, Bob, if I'll conditionally say that Elon Musk has said he will send people in an Apollo 8 type flyby mission around the moon. I think he said he'd do it in 2 years, which means by about 2021. If that flight occurs if the flight around the moon occurs before 2022, then I'd say we could be on Mars by 2030. If that flight is delayed, I would say it's going to be 8 to 10 years after that flight is successful. And I don't think it will be delayed. And by the way, everybody knows about SpaceX, but Blue Origin is interesting because Blue Origin's been very secretive. Blue Origin is owned by Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos owns everything. He owns the entire planet, and he will own even more of it by the time we're finished with the show in 45 minutes. Bezos has the kind of money that governments are reluctant to spend. And one of the things, that's hard for people like us to really understand, I mean, we can imagine it, but we can't really connect to it. There comes a point when you've made so much money that you literally cannot spend it. You cannot spend it. You can't. You're making so much money so fast you cannot spend it, and certainly you cannot spend it on anything that would improve your lifestyle to any degree. In other words, you could have every single car you ever wanted. You could have 50 houses, all this other stuff. When you get into that kind of money, it doesn't matter how much more he makes because his life cannot be improved. I don't know what that number is, but I'm going to guess it's somewhere around, $50 million, $100 million. Somewhere around there, you really cannot improve the quality of your life when you get that kind of money and above. So he's going to do something world-changing with it, and he's got the money to do it. So every time I order something from Amazon, I'm expecting something today. I know I'm putting retailers out of business, and I feel bad about that, but Stagecoach, the guys who made Stagecoach wagon wheels and hoop skirts from whale baleen, they're not around anymore either. And that's just the way things are. So if I'm going to pay shipping and handling to somebody to bring me something to my door, it actually makes me feel considerably better about all of this. Not that I felt bad in the first place, but makes me feel even better than knowing that it's going to use to put humans in space. Eric Blake says Bezos is Edison, Musk is Tesla. That's not a bad description. And yet another reason why I suspect it might actually be Bezos instead of Musk. We have, Southern California Edison and not Southern California Tesla, because while Edison was an inventor and wasn't, people like to say Edison didn't do anything, Tesla did everything. That's nonsense. Edison was a brilliant man, a brilliant inventor. He was a great businessman, and he took terrible advantage of Tesla. But my point is, Edison knew how to make this into a business and run it as an empire and make enormous profits at it, and that's what it's going to take. So I would say if the flight around the moon goes within the next 2-3 years, I'd say 2030 for Mars. Now, Pluto is nuts because, and when I say nuts, Bob, I mean it's just no way to predict it because genuinely, literally, there's no reason to go there. There is so much more to see before you go there. I'm sure we'll send, I was going to say I'm sure we'll send probes, but I got to tell you the pictures that the flyby happened just earlier, about a year now, a little less, something like that. And they're still sending back pictures. The thing recorded so much data and the signal is so weak that we're getting pictures never before seen by anybody of Pluto on a daily basis that are coming down. So, if we're on Pluto by 2100, that means we're everywhere. If we're on Pluto, even if it's just a put the foot down mission to Pluto, if we're on Pluto, we're everywhere because there's no damn reason to go out there that far unless it's just for a lark because you can. The limitation on all of this by far is rockets. By far. The problem is a simple one in terms of understanding it, but it's an exceedingly complex one when you're designing things and so on. But, if you look at the Saturn V rockets, it's 365 feet tall, right? You see this giant, enormous, fantastic white structure. All of this is to bring that tiny little triangle of the command module back from the moon. And everything else is spent to bring that back. And when that thing comes back, it's used up anyway. But it's a good example of the problem that you face, because if we put an extra 10 pounds on the capsule, then we have to put the fuel to get that extra 10 pounds to the moon, and then we got to get the fuel to put it back from the moon. And then we have to add fuel to cover the weight of the fuel that we've added, and then that fuel has to be accounted for, and on and on and on and on and on we go. We really, the measure of a rocket's efficiency is called specific impulse, and specific impulse basically tells you how much push you get for a unit of fuel. It's a measure of efficiency, not thrust. Ion engines have very high specific impulse. They're very, very efficient, but their thrust is so low that it takes them, 10 years to get up to speed, 6 years, that kind of thing. Chemical rockets, on the other hand, lots and lots of thrust, enough to get you off of the surface of the Earth, out of this big, natural, nasty gravity well that we live in. But they're just not very efficient. You can't carry enough fuel to burn them fast enough. We sent New Horizons to Pluto, and it got there in less than 10, was it 8 or 9 years to go to Pluto? Most missions to Jupiter took that long. This little probe got to the moon took Apollo 3 days to get to the moon. And I want to say New Horizons did it in something like 6 hours, 7 hours. It took 6-7 years to get the Voyagers and Galileo to Jupiter, and I think New Horizons did it in a couple, 12 months, 13, 14 months, something like that. That thing was hauling ass. And it was hauling ass because it was a suicide mission. It didn't have to carry the fuel necessary to slow down at the other end. You just burned pretty much every drop you had. You keep a little for course corrections, and you just, thing goes through the solar system like a bullet, and you time it just right, goes right past Pluto, turns around, takes pictures of everything, and then sails off into the solar system. I don't know when it's going to pass the Voyagers, which were launched in the mid-'70s, but it won't be too long before it's past them because it's going so much faster. So there's a lot of energy sources out there, but the problem is not that there is not so much energy. The problem is turning energy into thrust. That's the issue. So a measure of specific impulse is it's measured in seconds. It's a measure of the thrust over time kind of thing. But the equations come out so that the answers are in seconds. And give you an idea, it's off the top of my head from memory, but the Saturn V main engines, I want to say, had an ISP, specific impulse, of about 250. The shuttle engines were significantly more efficient. I think they were 450. Nuclear rockets that we built in the 60s and 70s out in Jackass Flats, Nevada at the nuclear nerds and nuclear research. Anyway, the program was called NERVA. And we built something like 20 or 25 functioning nuclear rockets. And because these are not using the energy of chemical reactions where you're taking, alcohol or hydrazine or something like that and mixing it with an oxidizer, in a nuclear rocket, you're just getting a whole bunch of uranium together, let it get really, really, really hot, pour some hydrogen over it, and have that hydrogen expand. And it's the energy of the expanse that matters, because the more energetic that expanse, the more thrust you get. The more thrust you get, the faster you can go on a unit of fuel. The NERVA rockets were coming in, the early ones were coming in at 700, 800. Certainly with a little tweaking, you could get to 850, 900. You get double the efficiency of a space shuttle main engine. They could run on hydrogen. So if you can find water in space out on Ceres or on Mars or something like that, you scoop up some of the water, you chemically split it into its two parts, you take the hydrogen and you run it for fuel, and you take the oxygen and you use it to breathe, and everybody's happy. So if we're really talking about exploring the solar system, nuclear rockets are the only thing that's even conceivably on the board. So like I said, the thing that matters is how energetic is that expansion of the gas. That energy is determined by how hot the combustion chamber is. The hotter it is, the more energy you can get out of it. The more your fuel, whether it's hydrogen or whatever, the more it'll expand, and more aggressively it expands, the more thrust there is. So a solid core nuclear rocket, like the ones at Nerva, which is basically just a giant cylinder full of uranium at critical temperatures, and you just literally squirt the liquid hydrogen through it, and it heats it up and come out the other end. That reaction is limited to about probably under 1,000 ISP because if you made it hotter, then the engine would melt. You're now at temperatures that are really the upper limit for metals and ceramics. So what can you do about that? Well, they had an idea I don't think it's ever been built, but one of the things that had been considered was something called a gas core nuclear rocket. And now you're talking about making a magnetic field. Not so strong as for fusion. You need an incredibly strong magnetic field for fusion, but you could take a magnetic field and you could inject ionized, or rather uranium in a plasma state. And so basically the uranium is now gas, radioactive gas, and it's held in this bottle, but it's not compressed to fusion, it's just held there. But because the container is magnetic and not steel or ceramic, you can get to much higher temperatures. Now you're starting to get to ISPs of around 2,000, 2,500, that kind of thing. Now you're starting to get fairly close to being serious. But frankly, I hope, I didn't believe this much before, but I'm beginning to have a little more hope. It's going to take something as revolutionary as the jet engine, more revolutionary than the jet engine. I think the only real answer to this is going to be some kind of reactionless drive. In other words, something that's not spewing stuff out of the back end. And we just don't know what that would look like just yet. There's some interesting stuff on the theory side. And this whole business of warping space-time actually seems like it could work. If you could create an area of space in front of you that was less dense than the area behind you, you'd basically slide downhill in a straight line wherever you wanted to go. This is something that's always interested me too, since you asked the question, Bob. Einstein's relativity theory says you cannot exceed the speed of light, and every single particle of evidence seems to say that's true. As you get faster and faster and faster, time slows down on board the vessel, but the vessel's apparent mass increases to the point where at the speed of light, the ship weighs as much as the universe. You can't push it past the speed limit of the speed of light. Cannot be done. And that has been the damning thing for science fiction guys like me and so on, to say that even if you could get to a really high relativistic speed, 0.8 c, 80%, 90% of the speed of light, it's not a terrible deal. You get to the nearest star in 5 years in a straight line. 5 years in a straight line, but you've got to accelerate to the speed of light, which at 1g is about a year. About 1g acceleration for about a year gets you pretty close to the speed of light. And then halfway around, you got to turn down and slow down the rest of the way. So it's probably 10 years to the nearest star under ideal, like theoretically best case scenario. But one thing that's interested me about this, and some people are working on it, I don't think I've ever heard anybody speak about it quite this way, is that we know we cannot exceed the speed of light, but what we don't talk about is that the speed of light is actually variable. That's interesting to me. The speed of light in water is considerably slower than the speed of light in air. That's why when you look at the water and you see a fish, the fish is shifted because the light coming out of the water is accelerating. When it hits the air, it's going into a less dense media, the light accelerates. Hard to believe, But that's what happens. So the speed of light in a vacuum is 186,262 miles a second in a vacuum. And you would think that there can be nothing less dense than a vacuum. But you might be wrong about that, because space itself, space-time has structure. There's actual kind of a structure. It's not atoms and it's not matter, but there is a structure to space-time. And if you could find a way to weaken that structure, weaken the fabric of the actual universe, then your light beam should be able to accelerate into that medium out of a vacuum the same way that it accelerates out of water into the air. So you could be traveling at speeds higher than the speed of light as seen on Earth, although within this particular bubble, you are not exceeding the speed of light. But how you propagate a wave faster than the speed of light is beyond my primitive frozen caveman brain. So nevertheless, a reactionless ship, I think. Well, it took half an hour. We got one from top fan Steve Darrow, and then we'll probably be looking at a text from Mr. Ott in the near future. Steve Darrow says, you've talked before about the importance of chrome in movies, especially militarily themed movies. I watched The Final Countdown the other day, and while I loved the plot, the lack of credible chrome was distracting. What military movies are the worst when it comes to their misuse of chrome? On the quasi-historical list, Hidden Figures has to be near the top. Come on, not a single cigarette is smoked. I think in terms of military, some of the worst chrome I've ever seen is in, the first thing that came to mind was, what was it, Iron Eagle? Is that what the Air Force equivalent, kind of the copy of Top Gun was? With Lou Gossett Jr., was it Iron Eagle? And strangely enough, it was about Falcons, about F-16s. So much of the symbology there is just terrible. I know it's got to be tough for Foghorn, especially who's an F-16 driver, to watch movies where you see, the whole front of your cockpit is lit up with nothing but a big flashing red light that says missile lock. And then a missile this big goes off the rails, just so you can see that the missile that you just launched off the rails right over there has actually gone off the rails. That kind of stuff drives me nuts. The chrome thing is a sign of laziness on the part of a writer who's not willing to do his homework and not just learn the terminology, but learn how and when to use the terminology. That is one of the first ones that comes to mind. I can't think of anything that really just leaps out at me, because there's not a big line between bad chrome and just plain stupid movie. Star Wars. Here's what bothers me. Here's an answer for your question. I think probably the worst chrome, if I think about it now, is actually in the movie 2010. And the reason that the movie 2010 is so awful looking is because 2010, the sequel to 2001, was made in the era of computers and computer graphics. But it was made really early in the era of computer graphics. And so you're stuck with a situation where 2001: A Space Odyssey, the screen displays in 2001: A Space Odyssey in themselves are works of art. If you really get a freeze frame down there, you can see Dave Bowman and all the rest of the stuff on the back. One of those pictures back there is of the inside of the Space Shuttle Orion. If you're ready to pause a frame or two in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and by the way, if there's any movies that don't need pausing, it's 2001: A Space Odyssey, because it's not exactly a wild ride through the pacing machine. But grab a frame or two of those and look at the thought that went into every single one of those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of displays that show up throughout the Discovery, show up throughout the docking mission, and on the Ares and the Orion moon shuttle, all of this stuff. It's astonishing how good it is. And the reason it's so good was because they were hand-drawn by animators. They might have been hand-drawn by Disney animators, but they were hand-drawn, and so they looked exceedingly sharp, and they're brilliantly thought out. everything on Discovery has a 3-letter code, and if you look at it, and you do nothing but look at the displays, you realize this is why Stanley Kubrick's a genius, and why 2001 is such a classic movie, because when you're dealing with geniuses, they have to get everything right, every little thing. Orson Welles would take 2-3 days to light one shot in Citizen Kane, and there you go. CP Tomes already beat it to me. But each one of these screens has a 3-letter display. There's another one from CP Tomes. NUC, nuke for nuke. NUC, that's the nuclear power plant stats. COM is one. HIB, HIB is one for hibernation. All of these things are the sign of somebody really going to the trouble to get the details right. And this is what Chrome means to me, the whole idea of things in there that are really just very clever. I remember reading the story of 2001: A Space Odyssey and how it was made, and some young woman, young girl really, I want to say she's 15, 16 years old, wrote a 20-page letter to Stanley Kubrick about 2001 and what it meant and some of the hidden meanings in it. And Kubrick flew her out and met with her because she was like apparently the only person that really got it. But there's a number of technical errors in 2001: A Space Odyssey. But the technical errors give you an indication of how much they got right. Probably the most famous technical error, at least the most visible one in 2001: A Space Odyssey, is he's in the weightless environment. He's traveling from the Earth to the moon. Haywood Floyd's going to the moon. And he's sipping various kind of, pastes. And here's cream corn, and here's, cream peas. And he's got basically little straws, and he's sucking this stuff out of these zero-gravity meals. And he sucks the stuff out of this one straw, and then the stuff slowly goes back down because he shot it on Earth, and the gravity's pulling the stuff back down the straw. Now, when you're dealing with that kind of hair splitting, you've got a real target there. Now, go and watch 2001, and then watch 2010, which was made 20 years later, something like that. 2001... Mike Mass, I've got to answer this. Mike Massetti asks, Bill, do you have to be good at math to become a pilot, civilian pilot, I mean? You have to be able to be good enough at math to be able to fake it, Mike. You have to know you're going to have to pass some fundamental problems in navigation, but I am not good at math at all, and I passed my private pilot's license and my instrument license. So the answer to your question is no, you don't have to be good at math, but you are going to have to study some math if you want to get that license. It's sensible math, but they're going to tell you, you appear at this fix at this time, and then you go on this course at this speed for this amount of time with this kind of headwind. What time do you pass this other marker? And you're going to have to learn how to figure that out. But fortunately, the Kings are there, John and Martha, who's... They're instructors, aviation instructors, have been doing it for 100 years. And John and Martha King both have pilot certificates, and where it says ratings, mine says private pilot. I should have gotten the commercial license right away because I was ready to pass that. And it says, so mine says private pilot, instrument, and so on. And John and Martha's license say all. Ratings, all. They're rated to fly everything. Hot air balloons, helicopters, gyrocopters, everything. But you'll get there, so hang in there. It's worth doing. And it's not real bad, not real hard. And in the days of GPS, you're going to need to know how to do it. But to be perfectly honest with you, even if the GPS fails in private pilot world, just, know where you are and learn pilotage. You get to your next airport. It's not that tough. So do it. Anyway, so we're back to 2010. Now, 2010 was made at a time... No, it's not trig, nothing like that. Nothing like that. You're never going to hear the word cosecant or any of that nonsense. You're going to have to be able to do fundamental arithmetic, really. It's just common sense stuff. And you're going to learn how to use a flight computer, which is a plotter that basically mechanically does what an electronic calculator does in no time. And you're going to have to learn how to do like course offsets. But you really do need to know these things, and it's challenging, but it's not daunting. So 2010. So by the time they make the follow-up movie to 2001, they make 2010, which I thought was a very poor movie in many ways, primarily because of Roy Scheider, who I don't know. I just don't think was really the greatest actor ever, but he was great in Jaws. But anyway, by the time they make 2010, computer graphics had just come along. We're now at the point of maybe the Apple IIc, maybe, or maybe the Amiga. And so they decided that for the computer graphics on board this advanced spaceship, they were going to use actual computer graphics from 1984 or whatever the year was. And you see these wireframe lines going, tuk, 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 tuk. It's just unbearable. It's unbearable. Unbearable how bad it looks. I want to say there was another one of those, maybe it was Hunt for Red October, same disease, made at the beginning of the computer graphics era, used actual computer graphics on a machine that maybe had a megabyte of RAM, and the stuff just looked like garbage. It looked good at the time because we didn't know what would look better, but boy, you want to talk about dating something. It's just terrible. And sexy Russian pilot in that movie of the Leonov is none other than Helen Mirren. And I am friends with, not good friends with, the gentleman who meets Haywood Floyd on the park bench in Washington. When I was first introduced to him, I basically said, "My God, man, I know you. You're the guy who talked to Haywood Floyd on the bench." Yeah. So anyway, so I think that's really it for the Chrome thing. But yeah, it's the little things that make things matter and make things work. We'll do one more until we hear from Scotty Otter, or we'll do 2 more or 5 more, whatever. Christopher Dale Goodwin says, looking at the future of industry and economy, what should Strata Loungers invest in? What does the future hold? Well, now we're talking about drawing on Bill Whittle's vast financial expertise and astonishing grasp of business niceties and details. So, needless to say, listen very carefully to what I'm about to suggest, and then do precisely the opposite. I don't know, Christopher. To be honest with you, it seems to me, if I had to take a big step back, that if you're, I mean a big step back, you might want to take some fund money, and you might want to invest it in technologies that are beginning to become somewhat widely accepted, and then ride that tide, but get out before they actually try to implement it. Because Bitcoin is a great example of that. I had a chance to get in on Bitcoin, and somebody told me about it in the first year, and if I had, I would have made a ton of money, but it doesn't seem to have a future. So what I'm saying is, find things that look like they're hot. If you have the discipline, stay with them while they're on the upside of that curve and they're growing fast. And when things just begin to level off, get the hell out. That is my total extent of my financial advice. And if you take my word on financial matters, you're an idiot. And you don't strike me as an idiot. So there you go, Chris. Hey, here's our top fan, my friend Merlin Wendelbo, who's quite a good shot, actually, as it turns out. The more I watch the anti-Trump circus, it seems to boil down to the eternal contempt of old money for the nouveau riche. One of America's founding principles is rejection of aristocracy, especially amongst the sheep-level liberals. How do we expose the fact that the liberal elite is the aristocracy and that Trump is the man of the people who would normally be the hero of the average college liberal? Well, absolutely right. I think the only part I would quarrel with is that I don't think the average college liberal has ever really had admiration for the people. They've had pity on the people, and they've had a strong desire to do what they could to make the lives of those, poor Neanderthals and the great unwashed with the sloping foreheads and knuckle dragging Neanderthals out in the middle of flyover country, they feel it's the that it's the liberal man's burden to lift common man out of his horrendously racist, stupid, anti-science, gun and religion loving superstitions. Trump carried working people. As I've said before, if the Democratic Party loses blue-collar workers, it doesn't just lose a voting bloc, it loses its entire soul, its entire identity. That process is underway. They cannot help themselves. There are some things that human nature cannot put a brake on, and self-congratulation is one of them. So the liberal elites that have taken over the Democratic Party are going to make more and more and more decisions that are more and more ridiculous, more and more constraining, less and less reasonable, and we have to hope that people will wake up to that before the shooting match is over. Certainly, if you listen to liberals or elitists, but I repeat myself, you listen to them talk about populism, they have nothing but sneering contempt for it. And they'll tell you that a populist is basically a snake oil salesman who sells patriotism to the rubes. And they have nothing but contempt for it because they think it's false. They think it's phony. How can it be true? You can't possibly be ready to be president or some higher level person and actually believe in the general public. I mean, that's just plain nonsense. It's insane to them. So they think all of this populist stuff is just basically posturing by other cynical liberals like themselves. But no. There are some people who actually have had enough experience talking to regular people and having had the grace to have had a little humility beaten into them, to discover that that there's not a person out there in flyover country that doesn't know more than I do about hundreds of things. Hundreds of things. They're much more well-informed about than I am, and I consider myself to be a pretty well-informed guy, and so do these progressives and these university teachers and all the rest. But they are too possessed by pride to see how limited they are, where scientists are often in the same boat too. You become so smart in one area that you assume that intelligence carries over to every other area, when in fact what it actually does is blind you, makes you assume that the world behaves like your computer model or your laboratory. And that's a fundamental misassumption, and you'd think somebody with those levels of intelligence would understand that. But the reason that scientists are scientists is because they're capable of producing an enormous amount of intellectual energy on focusing it on a tiny, tiny, tiny little dot. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way at all. Figuring out how to take one of these things from, 64 gigabytes to, 256 gigabytes requires the ability to focus your mind and not just do engineering, but science and all the rest of it. But because they have that focus, they don't see the bigger picture, and they don't seem... It's funny for me. It's not funny. It's tragic for me to watch these so-called either scientists or people who worship science. Like, I believe in science. Once you hear somebody say, I believe in science, I don't believe in religion, I believe in science, you're talking to an idiot. Not necessarily because they don't believe in religion, but because if they say, I don't believe in religion, I believe in science, they've simply immediately admitted to you they don't know anything about science, and they've also told you that science is their religion. And science isn't a religion. Science is not a religion. Science is not a belief system. Science is a set of rules for learning things from nature, and to say that I believe in science is to show that you really don't know really much about what you're talking about. I am well aware of and enormously respectful and admiring of scientific achievement. but I also know where the handle of the hammer stops. Science is a way about science is a way of thinking about a specific particular task that's designed to eliminate as many human variables as possible. And when it's done according to that formula, it does a remarkable job, an astonishing job. But when you try to apply that very deep, intense, maybe world-leading intelligence in one particular exceedingly narrow field and apply that to the rest of society, you've just made a really stupid mistake. One of the things I've talked about before, and I just happen to like, is you'll occasionally see progressives putting up these memes, and it'll be a picture of Albert Einstein, who I think without question was the smartest human who ever lived, and certainly he's in the top 5. And you'll see there'll be a picture of Einstein, black and white picture, and he'll have the big mustache and the wild hair and very high contrast lighting, and then in type, in front, floating in the black area in front of his side, there will be in big white letters, you cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war at the same time, something almost exactly like that. And then you'll see liberals repeating this because they're not as smart as Einstein, and they know they're not as smart as Einstein, but they want to sound like they are. So they said, if Einstein said this, and Einstein's the smartest guy who ever lived, then see, it's got to be true. This pacifism thing is so obviously true that even Einstein believes it. But the response to that is pretty much immediate, and that is, if you want to have a conversation about what happens as you approach the speed of light, then Einstein's your guy. But you wouldn't go to Albert Einstein for fashion tips. You wouldn't go to Albert Einstein for grooming tips. You wouldn't go to Albert Einstein for dating tips. What on earth makes you think you would listen to Albert Einstein for political tips? The fact that he's able to travel at the speed of light in an elevator, or to turn on the headlights of a car that's moving at the speed of light and wondering what happens, his ability to do that not only does not give him ability to do that on a wider scale of society, it enormously limits it. It's ridiculous to assume that Albert Einstein would know anything about people, because he's not a person in the way that we understand the word. His intellect is so large and so focused, but it is not of this earth. And I don't mean that in a negative way. He believed, as John Pershing just wrote, John Pershing said Einstein had great physics insights. He also believed a lot of socialist collectivist nonsense. Absolutely right. He believed a bunch of nonsense. My understanding is that he was offered the first presidency of the state of Israel. He turned it down, and thank God for the state of Israel that he did. If you want somebody's opinion on quantum physics or theory of gravity or space-time, by all means, put up a picture of Albert Einstein and any quotes he may have, like God does not play dice with the universe, which is a great quote, apparently not true. Apparently he does. And that's another thing, by the way, just because he's Einstein doesn't mean he's not wrong. He's wrong often enough for it to be a statistical number, and he's wrong about quantum. So there's that as well. But this whole thing with science is just it surprises me that people that smart can be that stupid. I mean, you would think that they would have the insight to do it, but I guess it's ego, it's a pride issue, really, not so much intellect issue. It's a pride issue. And now you get down to the difference between intelligence and wisdom, and I think certainly my experience in life, to whatever degree I've managed to achieve some wisdom, which is a significant amount of wisdom over where I used to be anyway, let's put it that way. I'm struck again and again and again that the fundamental quality of wisdom, I think, is humility, and that humility almost always has to be beaten into you, because if you're going to be smart enough to be wise about something, chances are pretty good you're going to be smart enough to think you've got all the answers, and that has to be stricken from the records, which is usually an exceedingly painful and long process. To be smart enough to be able to have some kind of actual insight into things, you have to have the humility to see beyond your own limitations or recognize that you have limitations in the first place. And usually that kind of humility does not go hand in hand with exceptional aptitude of any kind, sports or intellectual or whatever the case may be. AKA Woody Fool says, if you want to see wisdom, watch Mike Rowe's Bosses on Dirty Jobs. Absolutely true. But an even better point there is, if you want to see wisdom, watch Mike Rowe. Because Mike Rowe, who I've had a chance to meet and know and ran into at the airport, and I love the guy. And we were at a meeting once, and he was talking about this video, and said, anybody seen this video about this, where this guy breaks down the cost of what it costs to do in a year, and it's pretty good. Have you seen it? And somebody said, this guy over here looked familiar, and I said, oh my God, it's you. So Mike Rowe's actually wise, and he's wise because he's smart, but he's also wise because he's humble. Mike Rowe is the only celebrity I can think of that I would be 100% confident in as president of the United States. He's got a much better temperament than I do, and a much more grounded personality than just about anybody in show business. And yet at the same time, he has the insight and the skill to be able to do what I was trying to do earlier today with the story of Taffy 3. Mike Rowe's talent is his ability to tell common stories in a way that was entertaining. And that's not an easy thing to do. But when Mike Rowe was doing Dirty Jobs, and the first Dirty Job was Deadliest Catch, I mean, that's where he got started. And that's the dirtiest job, there is, the most dangerous job there is anyway. So when you see Mike Rowe doing what I talked about earlier, I want to say it was the beginning of last year, I guess, somewhere. When you see Mike Rowe crawling underneath a house to remove dead, rotting animals, and then coming out and barfing all over the place, you have to ask yourself, why is Mike Rowe doing that? He doesn't need to do it. He doesn't need the money. So why did he do Dirty Jobs in the first place? He did it out of wisdom, I think, and I really do think this is the case. To the limited degree I've talked to him about it, I think he did it for the same reason I told the Taffy story, which is I think he feels an obligation to the people who do this horrible work and get no recognition at all, while the people who do the easiest and most pointless and superficial stuff in our society are on everybody's name. Everybody knows their face, and they make millions of dollars. Being humble enough to go into a tannery, let's say, or to work in I can't think of all the different dirty jobs he's done, but sewage treatment plants and all the rest. Mike Rowe gets dirty, and I don't mean just like dusty. He gets filthy, and he gets filthy because he feels obligated to the people who get the filthy every day and aren't famous and recognize the way Mike Rowe is. So anyway, he's a super guy. He's just one of my favorite people I ever met in my life, and I'm enormously proud to be on the same side as he is, at least in the common sense battle. There's one more question here. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to take this real fast because I expect Scotty's going to be calling any second now. From Skip Hansen. He says, you're trying to use your video game to reach this, not my video game, but video games, to reach the younger generation and teach them the benefits of thinking conservative. If you get this generation to play and get the ideas that you're trying to send, what makes you think that they will come out of their mother's basement to vote? I'm 80 years old, and my last encounter with video games was Pong. I guess my generational gap is just too great. Well, first of all, Skip, just bouncing off of what we just said, anybody who says that my generational gap may be too great is a person who recognizes the fact that there may be limits to his own knowledge. So there you go. That's already the beginning of wisdom. My entire point on the video game thing is very simple. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. In fact, I'm not going to go into any detail. My thesis is this, Skip. The people that are playing video games are the future of the country. They're young people, and they're not watching movies, and they're not watching TV, and they're not sitting around watching Gilligan's Island, and they're not watching Friends and Cheers. They're playing video games. And my thesis is pretty simple, really. When you get into a video game, basically what you do is two things. You make money and you buy weapons. And the more money you make, the better weapons you can buy. And the better weapons you have, the more money you can make. And my entire thesis is that these people who do in fact vote for Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, that's not a joke, they absolutely do. But they behave, when you leave them alone, they behave like conservatives. We don't have to change their behaviors. They're already behaving like conservatives. They're buying guns and they're making money. I'm in favor of both these things. And they're driving fast. They're not driving around in Priuses at a reasonable speed. They're racing cars and jumping over hills and firing machine guns and blowing things up. So all of these are fun things to do. And the entire point is kind of encapsulated in your question here, because that old cliche about computer gamers living in their parents' basement is essentially true. It's essentially true. Thank you, John. I'm looking at the time, but I'm waiting to hear from Mr. Scott. Computer gamers do live in their parents' basements, not necessarily literally all the time, but one of the problems is that somebody once said, well, what are they going to do when it comes time to buy a house? And before I even thought about it, somebody else said, what do they need a house for? They don't need a house. What they need is a small apartment, a microwave oven, and a fast internet connection, because the games get better and better and better and more interesting, more and more believable, more and more realistic every single year. So the point, Skip, is that the reason that they're in their parents' basement is because they want to behave like conservatives in a world where that's not allowed. They're not allowed to be conservatives. They're not allowed to buy guns in the real world. They're not allowed to make money in the real world. They're not allowed to be heroes in the real world. They're not allowed to drive fast in the real world. They're not allowed to blow things up. They're not allowed to start making millions of dollars of in-game money. They're not allowed to do any of these things. And so the fact that they're in their parents' basement is actually not a bug. It's a feature. In other words, I've come to realize, and come to believe anyway, that they're in the basement not because they're losers, but they're in the basement because they can't stand the world that's going on out here and they have an alternative. There goes the buzz. And so on that happy note, I think we'll call it a day. Mr. Scott Ott has buzzed me. We're going to do one Bill Whittle now. Hopefully that'll save me having to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning tomorrow, and we'll sort all that out later. But anyway, sorry to have to aim all this stuff at such a quick close, but it's fun being back, fun doing the show as always, made possible as always by the very few paying members at BillWhittle.com who make all of this stuff possible. And if you'd like to be one of those people, we sure would love to have you. This is the time when we say goodbye to our YouTube friends, who we have nothing but the deepest admiration and respect for you tuning in and watching, time and time again, thousands of people, a few thousand anyway, watching this whole thing. And it's utter mystery to me, but the number of people watching on YouTube is many, many times greater than the number of people who are here watching in person. And on behalf of all the people here that are watching in person, I want to just tell our YouTube audience just how much we admire and respect all of you, and the live crowd just is nothing but the highest things to say about you. So as far as that goes, YouTubers, we will see you next week on the Stratosphere Lounge. Did that record? Did it not record that? That's not good. Although I did record it on the OBS, which means that all of the stuff is already in there. I strikes me that I did not hit the QuickTime recorder, but I'm sure I've got it the other way. By the way, I never like those people, those YouTubers. They're just a bunch of just savages and jackasses. So now I have to go put on my red shirt and my brown pants and do another Bill Whittle Now with Mr. Scott Otts. So been fun talking with you guys tonight. 2 hours. We got 2 hours in. Not too bad, I suppose. And also nice to tell the story about those men. I think about them all the time, and you probably should think about them some of the time as well. Okay, Gangaroos, that'll do it. And I think this is 201. How time flies when you're having fun. That'll do it for this episode of the Stratosphere Lounge, and I certainly hope to see you next week. If not, I'll see you the week after. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.